Black Saints in Early Modern Global Catholicism. It explores the global circulation of devotion to Black saints from the Mediterranean to the Americas and West Central Africa, examining the intertwined histories of race and religion on local, national, and global scales. I argue that the promotion of Black saints led the clergy to develop complex and ambivalent ideas about the spiritual meaning of Blackness, which could resist the emerging discourses of early modern embodied racism, while simultaneously reinforcing the brutal regimes of slavery. It's kind of that tension between those two things that I wanted to sort of get in and be able to examine. So clerical ambivalence to the inclusion of Black Africans in the fold of Catholicism fostered a complex climate in which creativity by non-Europeans was often met with rejection, even as white Europeans appropriated devotional forms propagated by Black Christians. The book further centers the role played by African diasporic communities in creating cults to Black saints in ways that had a lasting impact on white devotional practice. In this book, I create a framework for thinking with Black saints in the early modern world. So I started the project with a very simple question about who were these Black saints that nobody had really heard of or thought about very much, and just to try to uncover something about their history. And of course, it opened up this thinking with Black saints, opened up this much more sort of complicated, ambivalent world. During this period, as probably all the listeners know, millions of sub-Saharan Africans were captured from West and Central Africa primarily, although East Africa as well, and taken as slaves to Europe and the Americas. Europeans quickly formed legal and moral justifications for this massive use of slave labor, developing theories of difference that placed white Europeans squarely on top and Black Africans on the bottom. Yet a handful of Black saints, officially recognized holy people of sub-Saharan African origin or descent. And I make that, I specify there, define what I mean by Black, because of the long history of medieval Catholicism of the Black Madonna, which is a tradition that I was thinking with as kind of laying the foundation for what happens later, but is a very different topic from what I'm dealing with here. So these saints emerged during the same period as the transatlantic slave trade. The simultaneous appearance was no accident, but a deliberate move on the part of the Catholic Church to promote evangelization among enslaved populations. The chronology of the book stretches from the late 15th century with the advent of the Portuguese slave trade to the late 18th century with the apogee of Black sanctity in the aftermath of the beatification of Saint Benedict of Palermo in 1734. Devotion to Black saints clustered around specific African origin or descent. Benedict of Palermo, Antonio da Noto, Elsaban, and Iphigenia. Iberian Black communities quickly adopted all four saints, visible through their celebrations of the saints in their confraternities, which are lay religious organizations that were extremely popular and important socially throughout the modern Catholic world, and especially in the Iberian Atlantic. And the commissioning of their images. So the confraternities not only had kind of specific cultic devotion, that cultic devotion included images, which is how the visual component of the book came to be so central. As a result, even though we're talking about four saints and then some additional living Black holy people, or living saints as they're referred to, it's important to remember that one saint cult can exist in hundreds or thousands of different locations simultaneously. So we can't think, okay, this one saint, what does that mean? Like, how can that be important? Well, in fact, that one saint exists simultaneously in thousands of sites, and all of those sites have very specific a specific history with that saint and its cult, which is different over time and space and geographies. So I traced the devotion of these saints from 16th century Sicily to the Iberian Peninsula and throughout Latin America, with a particular emphasis on New Spain, which is colonial Mexico, Peru, Angola, and Brazil. Their widespread popularity provided opportunities for the emergence of other saints of color throughout the globalizing Catholic world, including India, Japan, New France, and New Spain. In Catholic understanding, saints are recognized as having lived without mortal sin. They cannot be criticized and are owed veneration from every Catholic. The elevation of a Black saint, therefore, turned established social and spiritual hierarchies on their heads. By the of Black saints in the early period, my study reveals that Catholic authorities eagerly encouraged devotion to Black saints and for evangelization of newly enslaved people, but also as part of a vision of universal salvation. In the process, they constructed a typology of Black sanctity that reflected deep ambivalences over the construction of spiritual Blackness and the Black Christians within the church. My interest in clerical constructions of Black sanctity did not stem from a desire to present such members of the clergy, the ones who are articulating these, particularly hagiographers, as anti-slavery. That was not my intention, or to in any way vindicate them from the indictments of white supremacy. Rather, the book emphasizes the deep ambivalence at play, the tension that I talked about in the very beginning, between their deeply held theological beliefs and the social political realities that both shaped and were shaped by theology. For example, all white clerical authors I analyzed stress the idea of redemptive suffering as a promise to enslaved Black people. That is, that their earthly suffering acted as a form of redemption in the hereafter. Some even called it a form of martyrdom. And that means, if you're a martyr, that means you would go directly from heaven without stopping in purgatory, right? So that's what redemptive suffering does. It shortens essentially your time in purgatory or the time in purgatory of other people. So as a martyrdom, enslavement required endurance, spiritual transcendence of one's daily circumstances. Such ideas have been threaded throughout Christian theology from the time of St. Paul, who wrote extensively about the relationship between the endurance of earthly suffering and the eternal reward for those that suffer. This is a really interesting element of Catholic theology during this period, and one that I think, interestingly, we don't quite emphasize enough. The role of redemption, the idea of redemptive salvation, and the way that it organized spiritual life during this period. So I had this experience, just a quick anecdote, with a student of mine many years ago. We were reading the spiritual autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila. And the student raised her hand, and she was really irritated with St. Teresa, and she said that she thought Teresa was a selfish person, a bad person. And I said, I was kind of inviting her to speak more about that. And she said, all she cares about is her own salvation. And the moment really made me pause, because I thought, okay, there's the gap between this, an enormous gap between this student's understanding of the purpose of what it means to be Christian and the early modern understanding. And yes, of course, Teresa's primary concern is her own salvation. That idea that the real world occurs in eternity rather than here on earth is, of course, central. And that what that means about the way we construct the world that we're living in is really complicated, right? But those need to be seen as aspects of Catholic theology. Whatever we think about the way that manifested during the early modern period, it is embedded in Christian theology from the very beginning. And it manifests here in really interesting, complicated, problematic, troubling ways, right? So on one hand, you have this idea of enslavement as a form of redemptive suffering, the ultimate result of which is a sanctioning of slave societies and their abuses. So the idea that enslaved people should just kind of endure patiently, and that's what God wants them to do. So and the church has a long history of these kinds of attitudes that are not just about enslavement, right? That we can see that earlier in the church's long history of wealth acquisition in the face of horrifying poverty, their sanction of certain kinds of heinous violence, like the Inquisition, their role in promoting anti-Semitic and misogynistic rhetoric. So while some priests would speak out against abuses against enslaved people, they did not explicitly speak out about slavery itself as an inherently unacceptable system. For the most part, there are a few exceptions, but they're very, very few. Many of these clergy were not only enslavers themselves, but invested financially in human trafficking. So the question for me as a scholar was how to think with these incredibly problematic and complex strains of rhetoric and practice, belief, and action. It seemed important to me as culture to emphasize that the authors I discussed genuinely believed that, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, but the spiritual purpose of life and its fulfillment was not in this world, that in this world we are attempting to be deserving of what happens in the next, that eternal life is the only true life, and that everything else is shadow. This central tenet of Christian theology, of course, also has the potential, though it's not inevitable, to create a kind of casual attitude toward horrific suffering. The horrific suffering of others, not usually one's own horrific suffering. On the other hand, this tenet was not just clerical rhetoric, but an aspect of Christian belief that many believers found incredibly comforting. So the idea that this world's suffering would give way to eternal rest and comfort provides some with the ability to endure the unendurable. As a result, we see the language of spiritual suffering brought by enslavement as something that could be and was adapted by Black Catholics, enslaved and free. So, two things. The first is to understand how early modern white clergy shaped new rhetoric of spirituality, Blackness, and race for the period of transatlantic slavery. And second, to see the multiple ways in which Black Catholics and those who were forcibly baptized but rejected Christianity shaped Catholic theology in the context of their own lived experience, right? So we can never just talk about the clergy and what they thought. We need to think a little bit about the reception and the ways that Black Catholics, Black Iberian Catholics are kind of expressing, experiencing, reacting to these theological, social, political realities that they found themselves in. So to provide one small example that I'm going to get to in a minute when I talk about these images I had to show you, the Black Catholics could use their money raised. So Black Catholics very quickly formed their own confraternities, right? These lay organizations, and they were opportunities for social interaction and kind of mutual aid, but also, of course, revolved around devotional practice, devotion to one or several saints. One of the things these Black confraternities did is raise money to purchase freedom of fellow members. So they're using the fact that their involvement in this kind of officially sanctioned religious institution in order to to resist, to use their status as Christians to provide legal and social avenues to pursue things like justice and mutual aid. So they also enter into lawsuits on behalf of their members particularly against enslavers. And so these confraternities played a really powerful role. And the way that Black Catholics were able to kind of use that was through this status provided to them as Christians participating in a Christian institution or organization. So Black Saints, the book, challenges accounts of the global spread of Catholicism that puts forward a European-centered cross-nation. So I've used the term global Catholicism in order to highlight devotions of non-European Catholics who created unique ritual forms and cultic devotions that in some ways, particularly the devotions themselves rather than the unique ritual forms, returned to Europe, which in turn transformed European piety. So we have kind of Black saints first being, they are originate in Europe, by European clergy. They get transported to the Americas, but once they get there, they are really given vitality, life by Black members of the confraternity. They're the ones who make them so important and popular. And then that popularity circles back to Europe in really profound ways that lead to, say, Benedict of Palermo's beatification. That beatification would absolutely not have happened without devotion to Saint Benedict by enslaved and free Black folks in colonial Latin America. Like, full stop. And I mean, like, Spanish Americas as well as Brazil. So in any event, the term global Catholicism is meant to sort of capture the devotions of non-European Catholics. Both the geographical reach of the Catholic Church needs to be rethought, but also, of course, the ideas of what we think of as center periphery, and also these paradigms that still show up sometimes in missionary studies about, you know, who are truly Christian and who are not truly Christian, and this kind of discourses about conversion, which I really find sort of both can be oversimplified and sort of unhelpful in understanding how non-European Christians thought about, understood, reacted to, lived, right, religion. Yeah, one of the most significant sources for the central role of Black saints in the early modern devotion comes from visual evidence, not from textual evidence, although there's lots of textual evidence, but there is even more, in some ways, visual evidence. So a good example of that is Black confraternities. So all confraternities have a patron saint or saints, and that's what the confraternity is named for. So the confraternity of Our Lady of Antiquity, and Our Lady, of course, referring there to the Virgin Mary, and of course the Virgin Mary and her various cults is the most popular patron saint of confraternities everywhere in the Catholic world. So we see Our Lady of such and such kind of everywhere. Our Lady of the Rosary was a confraternal evocation that was particularly popular among enslaved and free Black Catholics. So we see the name, let's just take Our Lady of the Rosary, for example. We think, okay, the Rosary Virgin is kind of the central devotion of this, for this Black confraternity, right? And then you go, and if you can find a chapel that used to be owned by a Black confraternity in a church, some of which still exist today, you could often find images of Black saints. And those images are not discussed in the paperwork, you know, the constitutions or other kinds of written sources for the Black confraternities. So if you only looked at the written sources, you wouldn't actually see how important devotion to Black saints was to members of Black confraternities. So I started kind of looking for images of Black saints, both in engravings and print culture, but even more importantly, the ones that have survived in painting and sculpture. And the book really focuses on the images of Black saints in Spain and Portugal. So sacred art plays a fundamental role in locating devotions, right? We can map devotions to particular saints on some level by following where they are, where the image is, there must have been a cult, right? And that's a very limited understanding of the significance of the saint, but it gives us an idea, right? It's a clue. So there are hundreds, maybe thousands, of images of Black saints. Most of the ones that I found are Baroque polychrome sculpture, and so the example on the cover of my book there is an early 18th century Baroque polychrome sculpture. Polychrome just means that it's painted, painted sculpture. So that have survived in present day European and American churches. I don't know the fate of those in Central African churches, particularly in Angola, where we know that there were images, but I know less about their fate. None of these images, or almost none of them, have been the subject of art historical analysis, and they've never been documented as a group. So what I was partially doing in this book is creating a visual archive, which is why it was so important to have so many colored illustrations, is I wanted the reader to get a sense of the variety and the complexity of different ways that Black saints could be envisioned and understood and depicted, right? So this visual archive was, so I thought I started with this very grand idea, even thinking about just Iberia, that I could sort of gather all of them in a way, see as many as I could see, document as many as I could document. But it was one of those things where as soon as I found some, then I found more, and it got overwhelming actually, more quickly than I thought it would. So none of those images, and so part of it too, I'm not an art historian, and I was kind of training myself as I went along, which was very challenging. And the fact that there wasn't any, scholarly study of these sculptures that I could find made it a little more difficult for me to kind of figure out how to understand them, particularly from a technical perspective. And some of these images, some of the sculptures have really only been seen by members of the parish. Sometimes I found them in really small towns in parish churches. So these are things that were not even really seen. And in some cases, which we can talk about later if you have any questions about this, were not actually even seen by the members of the parish themselves who lived with the images in Spain and Portugal. So one of the main things I'm trying to do here is to bring to light these images. And I began with Spain because that's my area of expertise. And at the beginning of the project, I wasn't sure what the geographic parameters of it would be. So I started, in my wheelhouse. And then I quickly discovered that the majority of surviving images of Black saints in Iberia, in the Iberian Peninsula, were actually in Portugal. So I'd never worked in Portugal before, but I moved quickly into Portugal and started thinking more holistically about the Iberian world rather than just kind of the Spanish world in a more narrow sense. So the presence of Black saints in the Americas, I can't overemphasize how incredibly important that tradition of devotion to Black saints was in the Americas and still is today in the Americas in many places. Hundreds of extraordinary images there are, particularly, although obviously not exclusive to Brazil, churches and sculpture and festivals related to Black saints. And so it's a living tradition in South America, particularly in a way that it is not a living tradition in Iberia. So let's see, I want to kind of skim through some of this so we can get to as many questions as possible. So I wanted to, just to kind of go back to my more prepared remarks. So the study of slavery and the African presence in colonial Latin America, which is extremely rich historiography, has offered important insights into the social and economic role of enslaved and free people of color in a wide array of local contexts. While works on Black confraternities in Latin America and Spain have also been fundamental to helping me figure out how to map devotion to Black saints. So lively current debates about the meaning of Christianity to early Americans, for example, and their enslaved brothers and sisters in Brazil have challenged some assumptions about some of my assumptions, I should say, not anybody else's assumptions necessarily, about issues surrounding this complex question about survivals of African religious practices. And one of the things, just as a parenthetical, I want to say is that there were Black confraternities in West Central Africa, really starting from the end of the 15th century in some of the Portuguese colonized islands, and then moving very quickly, particularly in Angola. We have lots of records of 16th and 17th century Black confraternities. So this is something, a knowledge of Black confraternities and Black saints could have come with enslaved people from Central America to the Americas. It could have been part of a kind of a Black African Christian kind of shared language, and which is a really interesting thing to consider, especially in the context of Brazil. So my book builds on these studies by bringing them in conversation with each other and creating a new narrative that centers religious culture in the evolution of early modern ideas about race and the Afro-Iberian experience of Christianity. The study is its examination of how devotion to Black saints began as an effort by white clergy to evangelize newly enslaved people, as I've mentioned, but we're quick. So we can't think about Black saints and their legacies as only being about the church and its efforts to to evangelize those who had been forcibly baptized once they had been enslaved. So missionaries transformed many parts of the world where they landed by introducing Christianity, depending on which region of the globe we're talking about. The act of creating a global church. So you have missionaries going out to the globe. But when we're talking about a global church, that could only be created when Christianity took root at the local level. And sometimes that is, as I just mentioned, through force, right? Through violence and colonialization. And sometimes it was a little bit more, the process was a little bit more organic than that. So not everywhere where Christianity was sent was there colonization. Japan is a good example of that. So all this Christianity at the local level, driven by, and even when there is violence, there is still a local Christianity that evolves out of that is not exclusively or even primarily being governed or controlled by white clerical elites in those places. So I think while missionary violence, for example, is really important to think about and continue to study, that this is not the only way that we can think about or understand the relationship between colonized subjects and particularly enslaved and free Black people and Christianity. So you have these devotions at the local level driven by local communities, which in turn had the ultimate effect of transforming the church in both ways, large and small. And the legacy of this process defines really the church today. If you think about the 21st century global Catholic Church, you see so many of these structures and patterns and traditions, kind of, you can still see them entrenched. People often say that the future of the Catholic Church is in Africa and South America. And of course, we still have, that's true if you look at places where Catholicism is continuing to thrive, right? But it also, the leadership, of course, of the church is still completely European and white. So we have that kind of tension still existing. So I know I'm out of time for my talking, but I just want to very quickly show some slides. Unfortunately, I had a different slideshow for you guys than I had for my. So if you saw the book launch, this is the same slideshow, but I had put something else together anyway. So I apologize for the repetition if anybody's already seen this. This is one of my favorite sculptures of Benedict of Palermo. And this is a relatively recent acquisition by the Detroit Institute of Art. If you're in Detroit, please go and see it. One of the things about sculpture is that you cannot capture the charisma or beauty of the sculpture in photographs very well, unfortunately for my book, but this is one that we actually can see in a museum, and it's pretty incredible. Um, this is like kind of the opposite end of that, in the sense that this was in a very small parish church in Portugal. This is again Saint Benedict of Palermo. This is a very simple sculpture. It doesn't have any of the signs of, you know, wealth or kind of major artistic school attached to it, but it is still, it remains a wonderfully interesting and important object. So here are some images of St. Elsman, since I mentioned him. And he is, I didn't really talk about, sort of ironically, I didn't really talk about who the different Black are. So we have these 16th century Sicilian saints, Benedict of Palermo and Antonio Donato, who were both Franciscans, who died at the end of the 16th century. And then the other two Black saints are Elsman and Iphigenia, were ancient Ethiopian rulers. So you can see here the crown on Elsman's head, right? On the left, and on the right, he has his foot on top of this heretic king whom he defeated in battle. He was an Ethiopian. And so sometimes that figure that he has his foot on is depicted white, as he is here, and sometimes he is depicted Black. And then one of the other really important elements to saints is giving space for or the presence of contemporaries. So 16th, 17th, 18th century Black Catholics to gain reputations for holiness, to enter into different religious orders and gain reputations for holiness. And this is a not very amazing quality. It's a badly conserved painting in Salamanca of one of its most important spiritual daughters, Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo, who was kidnapped in West Africa. She's about 9 years old and died in the odor of sanctity in Salamanca in the middle of the 18th century. All right, so I just wanted to show you. I have one of Iphigenia. No. So my apologies for not having an Iphigenia here. So now we can turn to questions. If anybody has questions. So I have a question here. Yes, I have a great question here from Jean Herbert, which is, what are the position of Capuchin missionaries about the cult of the Black Saints? Did they introduce this position in the first French colonial experiences, Brazil, Caribbean, Senegal, Goree Islands? You know, it's really interesting. The French don't show up very much in my studies and in my sources, which is not to say that they were not involved in the process at all. Certainly the Capuchins themselves were extremely important for the spread of veneration to Black saints. I just haven't heard anything or found any evidence or in Black saints, for example, in French Capuchin churches, in the same way in Iberia. Senegal is great, and I would love to part of what unfortunately kind of draw geographic boundaries is to spend as much time thinking through or visiting places where I thought that there might be images. My computer just gave me a notification that my internet is slow, so I hope I'm not going out and freezing. It's a great question. And were really important for the spread of cults to Black saints in Brazil. Absolutely. I mean, because as I mentioned a minute ago, two of them are Franciscan saints. So that was a really important part of their kind of missionary program, I guess you could say. Do we have any other questions? That's the only one in the queue right now. One of the interesting things when I was thinking about who were these Black saints, stand where they came from. You know, when you're studying religious culture and there's kind of a new saint on the scene, you have to figure out who is this saint and where do they come from? And sometimes that's very straightforward, like with Benedict of Palermo. Okay, he's a 16th century Franciscan, and I have lots of evidence, contemporary evidence about his life, right? And they were collecting beatification testimony very soon after he died. So we have a lot of like first person accounts of him and his and in his career, his miracles, etc. But if they are more ancient saints, then it can be really difficult to understand not only the origins of the and the cult, but also when people started first venerating them. And so I had to kind of think about the ancient Ethiopian saints on a different track. You have you can think of them colloquially as the sort of the humble Franciscan saints who are associated with slavery, although Saint Benedict was not a slave. The was born enslaved, and then the two royal saints, which is a really, again, a different kind of tension, right? So I have another here. I'm just going to read it out loud. What was your process for locating sculptures of Black saints at these smaller churches in the peninsula? What does the presence of Black saints in these areas suggest about of those societies? Which is another really great question by Dr. Keene. And so my process is it was a very complicated process where I was stitching together a lot of different sources. Some of them were things that I read about in primary sources. They would say, the image at such and such place is extremely important. Sort of ironically, though the majority of the ones that were talked about the most in the primary sources are the ones that I couldn't find. So the ones people talked about over and over and over again were images of Saint Benedict in Lima, image of Saint Benedict in Puebla, and then there were some others in Spain that I just was never able to find. So it was primary sources, and then also just sort of like random Google searches and Flickr, and just like I spent a ton of time doing a lot of different kind of search techniques on the internet because I couldn't really like wander around. The cultural patrimony of Andalusia has a really nice database, and there was a lot of information there, and they were extremely helpful with kind of direct me toward different churches. Also, the archive of the images of Black and Western art, so that's available through ArtStore, had quite a number of images of Black saints. So I kind of like put together all of these things to find those images, but it was really tricky. And ever since then, every once in a while, I'll get an email from somebody who says, "Oh, did you know about this one? Did you see?" And they're usually when people are telling me about ones that I didn't know about already, they're usually in a more northern part of Castile. So most of the work that I did, if you think about, was in Andalusia in southern Spain, where there was the most slavery, right, and the highest concentration of Black communities. These areas was a kind of synergy between where we found traces of the largest Black communities and where there were more images of Black states. Although that does not seem to have been exclusively, which is also really interesting. Although there is new work being done about the slavery in other parts of Spain that we haven't normally associated with the slave trade, which is really important, I think, research. Is there something distinctive about sculpture as opposed to images, either painting or engraving? Yes, I think on a couple of different levels, I can say yes to that. So I'll pick two that I think are the most important. The first is the vast majority of images that I found were sculpture rather than paintings or even engravings. Of course, engravings are ephemera, so it's not always surprising that we find few of those maybe. And I wasn't sure. I mean, any art historian maybe is just like rolling their eyes majorly but I feeling it was easier for sculpture to survive. And a lot of the places that I was looking at were places where there were, you know, catastrophes, right? Like the tsunami in Portugal, which I read about. There were fires like Lima, um, and and during there was a lot of violence against religious iconography in southern Spain during the Civil War. So we have lots of different ways that things got lost. But so I just have to find more sculpture in Baroque Spanish in churches anyway, or sculpture. Now, from a kind of an art historical perspective, like thinking about the images themselves and what they represent, the biggest difference is that you could see. Let me see if I can go back to the cover image. Spent a lot of time thinking about. You could see actually they're all very similar in a way. Let's look at this one, where the flesh tones, what we call in Spanish sculpture the flesh tones of the polychrome sculpture, are all uniform. So they tend to be black rather than brown, light brown, although they can be dark brown. The hair and the hands and the feet and the all this pigment, and that is different things which are more naturalistic representations, I guess. And so I argue in the book that this is a conscious decision. This is a spiritual decision to highlight of the saints as being a key component of their spirituality, as having a distinct spiritual meaning, which is why we see over and over and over and over again the same patterns in Black saints, which is very distinct from the way that white saints are represented. And I mean, I think aesthetically, no less beautifully, just differently. And so then it was kind of a question of thinking about, why is there that difference? So I loved kind of meditating about paintings versus sculpture. And I wish I'd been able to see more paintings because that would have helped. And I had there are some in the book that you can see some of the distinctions. There are a couple of paintings that are similar to the sculpture in the kind of uniform blackness that the saint, how the saint is represented, and on an oil canvas. It's extraordinarily hard to see. And of course, partially that's because they're not well conserved, some of those paintings. Okay, so then there's another question. How do the early modern saints relate to earlier Black saints? Okay, that's a great question, and it's really complicated. So we have Black saints that emerged on a couple of different registers. So the Saint Maurice that many of us are perhaps familiar with, who is a saint who really became popular in Central Europe in the Middle Ages, which is where the most famous images of him come from. Central Europe, Middle Ages, a little bit into the 16th century. But he's a strange saint because he's not always represented as a Black African. Sometimes he's just represented as a white guy. So there is some variation, which is also really interesting to kind of think about. And then we have the Black Madonnas, which I mentioned are kind of a case of their own. What does her Blackness mean? How many Black Madonnas are there really? How many were sort of darkened over time through environmental factors? So that gets complicated. But I think, when I am talking about Black saints, I'm really using kind of Spanish sense of Black person, right? A person of African descent, origin or descent, rather than the Virgin. One of the things that interests me most is as a sidebar about some Black virgins, but the Christ child, the Black. Nobody talks about this. Really interesting. But more to the point, I think one of the most important antecedents of Black saints, kind of iconographically, is more important than Saint Maurice, I think, is the Black in the adoration painting cycles, right? And so, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Paul Kaplan, particularly the art historian, it's kind of traced the when the Black Magus Balthazar becomes black, which is going kind of at the end of the 14th, but really picking up in the 15th and early 16th centuries until it becomes the ubiquitous representation of the three magi by the 16th century. And this idea of the Black Magus as the Ethiopian king representing a kind of universal Christianity becomes really important. I think sets the stage for the Black saints that I talk about, because the church is all about tradition, right? And tradition is all about precedence. And so Black saints aren't controversial because there's this long history of Black saints, which is something the clerical authors themselves are kind of explicitly meditating on. So there is a kind of extant history to Black sanctity in Europe that in some ways is kind of the Black Magus is more European wide, whereas I'm talking about probably post Reformation are predominantly Southern Europe. Which is obviously where in the 16th and 17th century you have the majority of Black communities. All right, and then there's another great question. Was the membership of the Black confraternities limited to men? And the answer to that is no. I'm sure there are places where there were exclusive membership to men, possibly confraternities that were exclusively female. I'm less sure about that. But all of the confraternities that I looked at in their constitutions, and I read a lot of constitutions, particularly Brazilian confraternities, but even in in Iberia and parts of Latin America, they all specify men and women as members. And one of the interesting things about the confraternities you'll see in the book is particularly the ones in the Americas where there's large enslaved and free Black populations. The confraternity, there are cities with 10 Black confraternities, and they could be divided by ethnonyms, ethnicity. And so, I mean, there's a lot of conversation about the ethnonyms used in colonial documents is kind of creating these kind of basically fictional African ethnic identities, but they are these terms. So, like Angolan, so you might have a confraternity that's for Angolan men and women, and sometimes they're very explicit about that. Sometimes they'll allow members from other, ethnic groups, like you can have Sape and with your Angolans, but only the Angolans can hold leadership positions. And the relationships in and among confraternities is really interesting and complicated. But yes, men and women. We have just a couple minutes left. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? I never thought I'd spend so much time thinking with confraternities, but they're really extraordinary topics, and their historical sources are incredibly rich. And you can find so much in those constitutions, but they have other kinds of source material when you get into particularly, contracts and those kinds of things. Confraternity members are buying and selling property. They're, as I mentioned, raising money to protect each other or to, and so that windows into really important aspects of how Black communities functioned, both in Europe and in the Americas. Oh, I got one last question. Okay. Have you ever noticed any connections to the apocalyptic literature of ancient Ethiopia and Ethiopian saints to appeal to the idea of the longevity of the early existence of global Catholicism? So, really and I would need to think about that. So off the top of my head, I would say no, I didn't notice, I didn't make that connection. I didn't see that connection in the sources, which is not to say that it's not there, just only that I didn't see it. And when I started this project, I thought, oh, we have Ethiopian saints. I need to really think about, the Jesuits or missionaries there in the 16th century. They're talking about they are in Christianity, really specifically. So I thought, okay, I'm going to deep dive and see what about, did the Jesuits basically pick up St. Osman from Ethiopia? And the answer seemed to be no, which was really interesting and surprising. Um, the early existence of global Catholicism and Christianity is really important, I think, in the figure of the Black mages. And even people have argued in the figure of St. Maurice, that's kind of what that Black saint comes to represent. Like Blackness itself as a signifier for the of universal Christianity and its long history. And they do trace it back to certain Old Testament figures, right? They start saying, look, the Queen of Sheba and all of these people are connected to Ethiopia. And there's a genealogy of Black saints that goes back to the sort of the earliest, goes back biblically very far. And that was really important to the Roman Church in the late 15th and 16th century in particular. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question. Because I didn't address the apocalypse angle to it. Yeah, I don't really see very much of that. The kind of idea in their discussion about these saints, which is really, that's really interesting thing to through. Thank you. Okay. Let me just make sure there's. Oh, sorry, one last, I'll just do it real quick. Can you say more about the reception of Black saints among white communities? Yes, so this is really interesting, just very quickly, because I didn't think that there would be a lot of devotion among white Catholics in particular, but it turns out there was. And this is one of the things I think about when they get important enough, they get a reputation for holiness and doing miracles, especially certain images, then white communities want in, right? They want access to that sacredness. And of course, the orders, the Franciscans and the Carmelites, are pushing their saints really hard. And it's part of their own histories and their own stories that they're telling about themselves and their own holiness. And so you get a lot of images of Black saints in Franciscan and Carmelite churches throughout Europe, and sort of their advertising. And then the presence of the image can kind of generate its own devotion life among communities. That there's a little section of the sort of weird and intensification of the language of spiritual slavery among white confraternities in the 16th and 17th, in the 17th century, which speaks to this kind of circulating, like a kind of communal experience of Black sanctity that the white Catholics kind of want a piece of, basically. They're happy to appropriate.